Good morning, everybody. I will be speaking through a shared microphone that Anne and I are using. That's why you might be seeing my mouth moving, but the mute button on the bottom of my screen. So basically, welcome to this first in our webinar series. The purpose of this series is to introduce you to the topics of climate change and its impact on the African entrepreneur. During the course of this 10 weeks, we're going to be exploring different topics around the threat and challenge, as well as the opportunities that climate change brings. And we're going to be joined during the next 10 weeks by a series of experts and young entrepreneurs to illuminators, to educators, to share with us their experiences, their knowledge, and their skills and understanding. So it should be a really exciting webinar series, which we hope will bring real and meaningful change to the businesses that you operate across Africa. Now, we have got a lot of people joining the call today. We had over 280 people, nearly 300 people register for this webinar. And we are recording this, as we will do with each one. And after each webinar, we're going to be posting the recording onto our YouTube site, as well as sending you a PDF of this meeting, so that you have a physical record of what we have been talking about. I am joined by my colleagues today, Dr. Anne Rollin here in Switzerland.
Hi.
As well as my very fine colleagues, John Magonia and Sheila Bohonia, members of the Agripreneurship Alliance in Uganda.
Hello.
Hello.
As you can see, they're very vibrant. It's very early in the morning, and I'm not sure if they've had their breakfast yet, but all is good. So one key thing is we have invited people from every corner of Africa. And that brings the challenges of multiple languages. Now, today we are, and in the future webinars, we are going to be working in English. However, it's important for us to be able to communicate with our friends in Francophonie. And so we do have live French translation. The way to access this is on your Zoom console that you see in front of you. Zoom down to the bottom of the Zoom screen, and you will see a number of options come up. One of them looks like a little globe, a little world globe. Click on that, and you will then have the option to change to the French audio channel. And that's where we have our good friend working hard away, trying to follow what I'm saying and what Anne is saying, and translate it into the most perfect French that you can imagine. If there are any problems, just put a note into the meeting chat, and Sheila will be managing that today for us, moderating it, and she will bring our attention to any problems or opportunities that you would like to bring. In terms of the chat, a standard thing is please introduce yourself, post in the chat room who you are, where you are, what your business is, what your interest is, as well as please, if you have any questions at any time, please do actually post those into the chat so that we can see them, so that we can then either respond directly to that question, or if we are able, we will actually then invite you on live to the webinar to ask the question yourself. What we do ask, and this is actually quite important to enable us to roll the webinar along, is please make sure that your microphones are on mute. It can be very distracting for our speakers if we hear a lot of background noise or somebody comes in unannounced. So please do keep your microphones on mute unless we invite you to come in and ask your questions, at which time unmute and talk away. So, I, for once, am not going to do a lot of talking. What I would like to do in the first instance is pass you over to my very good friend and colleague, Dr. Anne Roulin, President of the Agripreneurship Alliance. And Anne is going to introduce us and put into context climate change and the African entrepreneur. Thank you, Anne.
Okay. Thank you, Stephen, and a very warm welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining. So, even though Africa contributes only 2 to 3% of global greenhouse emissions, it's the most vulnerable continent to climate change impacts under all the climate change scenarios. So, Africa faces exponential collateral damage, which poses systemic risks to its economy, infrastructure, the investments, water and food systems, public health and agriculture. A recent report by the World Meteorological Organization talked about the water stress and hazards, withering droughts and devastating floods hitting African communities, and rainfall patterns being disrupted, glaciers are disappearing, and key lakes are shrinking. So anyway, Africa's climate is changing significantly. And I said it is the most vulnerable continent to climate change. Now, you see all the statistics, but then this actually comes down to individual entrepreneurs. And the rising temperatures and extreme weather, Africa warmed at an average rate of around 0.3 degrees per decade between 1991 and 2021, which is faster than the previous 30 years, which was only 0.2 degrees C per decade. And maybe 0.23 doesn't seem very much, but over 10 years, this is a very significant figure. Sea level is rising and it's increasing along African coastlines at a higher rate than the global mean. Drought has worsened, especially in East Africa, the devastating droughts in Kenya and a number of other countries, as well as extreme weather, both severe floods and also extreme heat, accompanied by dust storms and wildfires and other natural disasters. Now, this comes down also to individual entrepreneurs. And this is a short video filmed by Charity, who is a young entrepreneur in Malawi that I've been mentoring for the last 18 months. And this is the result of Cyclone Freddy in March of this year. Now, Charity had just been awarded a grant from the Tony Elumelu Foundation of $5,000. And with this, she had built her fish farm, constructing the first pond. She had dug a canal from the nearby river to bring water into the pond. She had stocked it with fish, and she had planted maize as a partial feed for the fish, and also planted tomatoes as a cash crop. And here you can see the devastating effect of the cyclone. The canal is almost destroyed, but when I talk to her, she considers herself lucky because she and her family are all still alive. She's lost about half the fish, not all of them. She's lost most of her maize, but she is determined to carry on. But this really shows the impact on one individual entrepreneur. So with respect to water, freshwater sources are shrinking. Lake Chad, for example, shrunk from 25,000 square kilometers in the 60s to 1,350 square kilometers today. Glaciers in equatorial East Africa are retreating at a faster rate than the global mean. So this is Mount Kenya, Mount Kilimanjaro, and the mountains in the east of Uganda as well. We can also see this happening very, very fast here in Switzerland. And glaciers are a very important source of fresh water supplies. Increasing water stress, comes from more frequent droughts and heat events, but also increasing consumption due to population increase. And so this is going to put additional pressure on already scarce water resources. Very few countries in Africa have really an integrated water resource management. 27 out of 51 African countries that have been measured have inadequate capacity to implement this water resource management. And this, combined with very low levels of irrigation, Sub-Saharan Africa has 95% of rain-fed agriculture globally. So there is really very, very little irrigation, making agriculture almost completely dependent on the rains coming at the right time and in the right quantity. What all this means, it's going to threaten food insecurity, conflicts and displacement. The increased temperature contributed to a 34% reduction in agricultural productivity growth in Africa since 1961, at the same time when population is increasing. When we reach 1.5 degrees centigrade global warming, this is projected to bring a decline of 9% of the maize yield in West Africa, and somewhere between 20 to 60% of the wheat yield in Southern and Northern Africa. So this is going to lead to displacement and migration. And already in 2021, 2.5 million people were internally displaced in Sub-Saharan Africa due to the disasters. Now, when we look at systems and services, early warning systems, the rate of implementation of multi-hazard early warning system is lower than in most other regions. Only 4 out of 10 people are covered. So there's a real urgent need to improve climate services provision in Africa. And in the webinar next week, we're going to hear from Ignicia, who are implementing these kind of climate services. So with all this, it's absolutely essential to build resilience. And we will be hearing a lot more concrete examples of this during the webinar series, but just a few short examples right now. Looking at drought-resistant crop varieties. So new varieties of maize that need less water, but also changing to crops like sorghum and millet, which are much more resistant to drought. Installing low-cost irrigation systems. Our partners in Somaliland have installed some very low-cost irrigation systems that enable them to conduct horticulture in Somaliland, which is totally new. There is no horticultural production normally in Somaliland due to the arid climate. But by installing these systems, they are now able to grow tomatoes, melons, onions, etc., and really have produced this locally rather than importing it. Other examples are climate smart feed systems. And in next week's webinar, we'll be hearing about the use of the black soldier fly larvae that can be used as a feed system for chickens and other livestock. And on the right of this picture, this is actually taken from a farm in Uganda, where it's a 1 acre farm where they actually have cattle and they're growing fodder hydroponically with very, very simple systems. These grow in just a few days, and then they take this type of grass, mix it with hay and some supplements, and use this as a major source of the feed for their cows. Early warning of pests and diseases is also absolutely essential to build resilience. Low-cost smart greenhouses are coming. There's a lot of work in developments, for example, in Korea to develop low-cost smart greenhouses. And finally, insurance. Insurance against these extreme weather conditions is becoming more and more available and more affordable. So these are just a few examples that we'll see more of in the coming series of the webinars. But it isn't all gloom and doom. This is a quote from the African Development Bank. Climate change also provides opportunities for Africa to harness its huge resource potential to achieve the targets of the Sustainable Development Goals. And addressing climate change in Africa will create significant market opportunities on the continent, especially for the private sector and institutional investors, and also for small entrepreneurs. So that was the end of my short introduction. And now I'm going to hand back to Stephen, who's going to introduce the next speaker.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you for everybody who's putting their names where they are into the chat box. It's really exciting that we have people from South Africa, from Zimbabwe, from Namibia, from Kenya, from Uganda. And if there is anybody else, we've got somebody from Tanzania. Hi, Michael. Thank you for joining us. It's really exciting that people have joined this webinar from right across the great continent of Africa. Moving on, we have a great friend. Vanessa Nakate is a climate change activist and UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador. We invited Vanessa to join this webinar, but unfortunately, as you can imagine, she is incredibly busy. But she was kind enough to allow us to share a video message with this climate change webinar. Vanessa is a graduate of Makerere University Business School in Kampala. And a few years ago, inspired by Greta Thunberg in Sweden, she started by herself as a lone young woman, demonstrating outside the government buildings in Uganda, to try to bring an awareness of the importance of addressing the climate threat. And from that, Vanessa has become a great voice for young people, an advocate for Africa, and has been involved at global level conferences as well as local activities and organizing local engagement. So we're very grateful to Vanessa that she is willing to speak to us today. As I say, this is a short video recording that has been made for us, and I hope you find her words as inspiring as I do.
My name is Vanessa Nakate, and I am a climate activist from Uganda, and I started activism last year in the first week of January 2019, and this was mainly because I was worried about the future. I was worried about the issues and the disasters that people were facing. Of course, being a student from MOOBS, you would ask yourself, why would she be interested in climate activism? Yet MOOBS is basically a business school, and there is no much education about the climate crisis. So in the year 2018, I started doing research, and this research was led by the fact that I wanted to drive change in my community. So I started to do research about the challenges that people faced, because I wanted to see a way how I could use my voice, how I could use my platform to help the people who are being affected. And I was really surprised to find that climate change was one of those challenges, because growing up, it was never told as a threat in school. So I didn't know that it was a reality. I didn't know it was the greatest threat facing humanity right now. And being a business student, I didn't know much. They didn't teach us much about, actually, I don't remember any lectures about the climate crisis. So this led me to dig more into what it really means, what causes it, and the challenges that people face. What is this thing called climate change? And I got to understand what global warming really means. I got to understand the impacts that people face as a result of the climate crisis. Of course, in the news, I had seen some of these impacts, but I had never connected them to the climate crisis. For example, the droughts, the floods, I really had no connection with the climate crisis. This led me to dig more to understand how my country, Uganda, is specifically affected by the climate crisis. And what I found out led me into deciding to take climate activism. When you go to the northern part of the country, it is heavily struck by drought seasons. It is struck by long dry spells. When you go to the western part of the country, we have seen so much of flooding. We have seen river banks burst and people's homes are swept away. When you go to the eastern part of our country, that is the Mount Elgon area, we have seen landslides. We have seen flooding as well. When I saw how much a danger the climate crisis was, I decided that I had to do something about it, because it was clear that the climate crisis was destroying people's livelihoods. It was clear that people could not have access to food if we have the climate crisis. People could not have access to clean water if we have the climate crisis. When Lake Victoria water levels rose up, many houses were encroached, but even toilets were submerged. And most of the communities around the lake, they used the water from the lake, but the water got contaminated because of the toilets being submerged as well. This caused a water crisis. So with floods, there is a water crisis, because all the dirt will be submerged into the water sources and people won't have access to clean water. We will see more children below the age of 5 dying because of diseases like cholera. But even with the droughts, there is a water crisis, because families have to walk very long distances to try and get access to water. What do you expect them to do if the streams are dried up, if the wells are dried up, if the boreholes no longer give them water? This really struck hard in my heart when I realized the challenge of the water crisis. Now, when you go to the food crisis, we understand so much how climate change affects the agriculture sector. We cannot have quality food with the increasing global warming because of the changing weather patterns. A farmer will grow his or her crops, and a flood will happen, and they will lose their crops. A farmer will grow his or her crops, and a drought will take place, and the family will lose their crops. So I'm just talking about the primary effects of the climate crisis, what people face at first hand when disaster strikes. They will face the droughts, they will face the floods. We've seen hurricanes in different parts of the world. We've seen intensity of wildfires. We've seen heat waves, pollution in different parts of the world. But people forget about some of the secondary impacts that come from the primary impacts. What happens to a family when they experience a flood? What happens to a community when they experience a drought, whereby that community depends on a specific water source? I'll give an example of Lake Chad or any other lake you can think of. lecture has shrunk to 10th each size. So the water sources are reducing. The population is increasing. So the number of people that have access, that need this water, is increasing, but the water is reducing. So this is going to cause a conflict. So conflict, as some, is one of the secondary impacts of the climate crisis. This is where the urgency comes in. We will see the droughts. Media will report the droughts, it will report the floods, the hurricanes, the cyclones, but they won't talk about the secondary impacts. Those are the conflicts in regions whose resources have been affected by the climate crisis. What happens to a family when they lose their crops? Many of them are going to stop taking their children to school because the school expenses were being taken care of by some of the food that they were selling. But if they lose it, that means some of the children will stop going to school. And that also means the children will start to work with their parents to build back what has been lost, to recover what has been lost. So that is education affected. And when education is affected, this family cannot get out of a poverty trap. They are continuously pushed into a poverty trap because if their children don't go to school, they won't have the opportunity to study. They won't have the opportunity to apply for jobs in this competitive employment industry because they don't have any qualifications from school. The African continent, with all its countries, we understand that in the rural communities, it is the women who do most of the work, putting food on the table, putting water on the table. So meaning gender inequality is going to be increased. Women are going to have to walk longer distances to get water for their families. And it's most likely that the girl child will be the one to drop out of school. Last year, I read an article that was talking about children brides, connecting them to climate change. When a family loses everything to the climate disasters, they give up some of their children for marriage because they receive bride price and they're reducing the number of children at their homes. So this puts the life of the girl child at risk, as many of them head into early marriages, unwanted marriages, hence destroying their livelihoods. We see street children in Kampala, but most of these street children, they are from the northern part of the country. But what is happening that side? People are experiencing so much dry spells. So they're being forced to migrate, to look for better ways of survival. And of course, they expect to find survival in the cities, only to reach and realize that they have to beg in order to survive. So this is what creates the urgency. Realizing that climate change affects every other sustainable development goal. Because you cannot eradicate poverty without climate justice. You cannot achieve zero hunger without climate action. We can't have partnerships without climate action because at the end of it all, the leaders have to all decide. They all have to agree to take global climate action. We cannot have peace, as I've explained the conflicts, without climate action. Life underwater, life on land is still at stake without climate action. We all know the cause of the climate crisis. We all know what contributes the most to the global emissions, and that is the fossil fuel industry. Look at what happened in Mauritius, the oil spill, life underwater completely destroyed, communities completely destroyed. they actually declared an environmental emergency. They are in a disaster because of the oil spill. We cannot have gender equality without addressing the issue of climate change. So this is an issue that affects every sphere of our life. That is why we need to take a road towards sustainability, towards sustainable economies. And what are sustainable economies? First of all, they are socially inclusive, meaning that the economy cannot develop at the expense of the people. So if the economy is to develop, then the people have to be inclusive. People's needs have to be taken care of. And one of those needs is the right to clean environment, to clean air for breathing. That is what brings in the environmental sector. A sustainable economy embraces sustainability and protection of the environment. But how can we bring about this sustainability? How can we bring about these alternatives? And what alternatives do we need? Of course, if it is agriculture, we need more smart agriculture, because we understand that in a way, agriculture also contributes to global emissions. So we need smart agriculture. For example, including agroforestry, embracing agroforestry, using more of cover crops. We have to embrace smart agriculture to reduce on the emissions from the agriculture sector. Then we also have to move towards renewables, not just in the agriculture sector, but in our families, in our schools, in our workplaces. We need to embrace renewables like solar energy, because we know it doesn't include emission of greenhouse gases and it uses less water, hence protecting our water sources. We also have to move towards resilience, because a sustainable economy, a sustainable country is a resilient country, is one with resilient cities. So building resilience in cities and in rural communities is also important for a sustainable community, so that even when a community experiences a drought, they already have water harvesting mechanisms that enable them to still have access to water, even in the trying moments of the dry spells. So there is much more that we can do, and I believe that it is possible. I am personally, I'll talk about my experience and what I do, because someone may ask, how can I get the funds? How can I drive change in my community? Last year, I started a project that involves the installation of solar energy and eco-friendly stoves in schools. And of course, you can imagine installing solar, powering a whole school, and the eco-friendly stove for a whole school. It must be expensive. But if you set your eyes on what you want to do for your community, then you're able to do it by fundraising, by applying for grants. And as I speak right now, I've made installations in 4 schools so far. And hopefully many more schools can receive those installations, so that we are able to drive this renewable energy in schools, so that we reduce on the amount of firewood that is used by introducing the eco-friendly stoves, because everything needs to be done, but we all need to work together, because the people working together, they are able to transform the world, they are able to drive change in the world. Everyone is able to drive change in their families, in their communities, in their countries, and in the world at large. All you need is the will. All you need is a platform. All you need is a voice to demand for action, and yourself to drive change, because it is those small acts. Imagine millions of people doing small acts to drive us towards a sustainable future. When you add up all those small acts, you realize how powerful and how impactful it is. So the people united, the people working together, they are able to transform the world. The climate crisis is real, it is dangerous. You may not feel the impacts directly, but think about communities that are feeling the impacts directly. And you may say, I may never fall a victim of the climate crisis, but all of us stand at a risk of facing the disaster of climate change. You see, Kampala, every time it rains in Kampala, it is very risky to walk as soon as the rain stops because you never know when you're going to fall into a ditch that is filled up with water. You see how the weather patterns have changed. When rainfall comes, it is a lot and it causes so much destruction. So all of us can be affected by the climate crisis. All of us can be victims of the climate crisis. But then all of us can do something to change this. We can do something to move towards sustainability. We can do something to change our homes, to change our lives, and to change our communities. I will end with this. Every person is able to carry solutions that will drive change and that are able to save a life in their communities. So whatever you do, whatever you discuss, whatever activities that you get involved in, you may not see the change immediately, you may not see the change, but you're actually changing a life. It may not be a life in this generation, it may be a life in the coming generation, because we cannot compromise the resources of the coming generations. That would be greed, that would be selfish. If we found resources on this planet, we have to protect them, we have to take care of them so that the coming generation, they are able to enjoy them as well and leave them for the next generation. Thank you very much.
Powerful words.
My name is Vanessa Nakate, and
So powerful indeed that we're going to have it twice. So we're very grateful for Vanessa for speaking to us. I think for me, there are some very key points that Vanessa brings forwards. Obviously, climate change fundamentally means a changing of the weather in the short, medium, and long term. And a large part of that we are all experiencing is changes in temperature and changes in rain. And for some of us, we're getting much hotter temperatures and less rain. At other times, people are experiencing vast amounts of rain and extreme weather events. And these changes, as Vanessa has very clearly said, have got secondary impact. The fact that they will change agriculture, the way that we produce food, has to become more resilient and adaptable towards the environmental changes that we're experiencing. We are aware that climate change will bring about an impact upon poverty. And while people have been rising out of poverty over the last decade, there is a danger that people remain or re-enter a poverty trap. We know that it will impact upon education and access to education as schools are closed because of flooding. We know that people will start to move, as they already have done so, because areas where people live start becoming less productive, and that ultimately this can lead to conflict. So climate change is a big global issue that all of us have a responsibility for working with in one way or other. Now, what we're going to do here is we actually have a poll, which we would very much like you to answer. Concerns about climate change. What concerns you most in your life, in your work, in your aspirations? Are you, and the idea is choose one, and we have got extreme weather events, we have got drought, we have got drying rivers and lakes, we have got declining water supplies, we've got reduction in crop yield, and we have got rising sea levels. So for you in your lives, what is most concerning? And we'll let this poll just run for a moment or two. And while this is happening, I would just like to ask if anybody has any questions or points that they would like to raise. I can see in the chat that people have really valued, I think, what Vanessa was saying to us. So Sheila, are there any questions at this moment in time?
No, there's none right now.
Okay, that's fine. Please remember, if you have any questions, put them into the chat room where we can see them, and then we can either respond to those directly or we can invite you to speak. So we have got 25 out of 25 people have actually answered the polls. That's 100%.
No, 25 out of 50.
Oh, sorry. So 26 out of 26.
Yeah, 27.
Okay. So we've got a few more people. So please let me encourage you to respond to this. At the moment, the two key points in the lead are drought and reduction in crop yield. Will this change? So let me give you 5 more seconds, the last chance to actually fill in the poll. We've got 30 people have completed. Can we get to 35 more in 10 seconds? In 5 seconds. Will reduction in crop yield be the prime concern of this group? And we will close in 3, 2, 1, and we're finished with 32 people answered. Thank you for playing with us. As we can see, 34% of people are concerned about reduction in crop yield. And there is some work that has been done that there could be challenges with regard not only to crop yield, but also to nutritional density in foodstuffs. We know that drought, changing rainfalls, is going to be a major concern. And in third place, extreme weather events, cyclones, as we have already heard about. So thank you for playing. What I would like to move on to is our colleague John in Uganda. Would like to really look at some of the opportunities, the challenges and solutions that young entrepreneurs and others can bring into their businesses. So John, how are you today?
Very well, Stephen. How are you doing?
I am good. The sun is shining in Switzerland and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I welcome you, ladies and gentlemen, to this webinar, which is the first of 10 webinar series that we are working on this topic of climate change and African food entrepreneur. My name is John Mugonya. I'm Program Manager Uganda at AgroPrincipe Alliance. I also have interest in entrepreneurship. I am an entrepreneur myself with various interests, but I've mentioned one. I have interest in honey. So the topic of climate change is very important to me because, you know, climate change affects the bees population, which affects honey production, but most importantly, it will affect crop production since bees are major pollinators. To the main point of my discussion today, I have the opportunity to share challenges and opportunities that climate change presents us. As it has already been acknowledged by previous speakers, climate change has increased the incidence and scale of floods, droughts, pests, and diseases. And these problems present opportunities to businesses, but also there are major challenges that businesses have to navigate. So I'll be able to highlight a few in this short presentation. So on the slide here, we have one of the key challenges that climate change brings, which is reduction in the agriculture productivity. So the droughts will limit the soil moisture, floods will cause soil erosion and wash away crops, and changes in temperature will affect water access, but also it affects growth rates of animals, because if animals can't access water, there are changes in rainfall patterns. So you will have less water for these animals and their growth will be affected. So all these factors put together, they affect the productivity of land, but also of animals. So for businesses that are dependent on agriculture products, they'll have limited access to these raw materials that they need, and this will affect prices in the market. So that is a very big challenge that climate change causes to businesses. The other cause that we really maybe understood its scale during COVID-19 is the supply chain disruptions. Because of the effect on the productivity and production of crops and animals, businesses will not be able to access the raw materials they need, because either the crops have failed, so the raw materials that you need to produce your products are not there, or they are in limited supply, or even if there's a flood, the roads might be non-motorable, non-navigable. So you can't reach these rural areas. For people in the North Rift of Kenya and the Kerio Valley, if you're thinking about Elgeyo Marakwet, Baringo, West Pokot, or even the eastern part of Uganda, Mount Elgon region, these places become very hard to navigate when there are heavy rains or floods. So the supply chain disruptions is really a big challenge that businesses have to navigate. The other is the risk to the reputation of businesses. Because when there are supply chain disruptions, businesses are not able to maybe meet the supply obligations that they have. And this will mean that they can have legal suits. Sometimes there are public protests if a business is really producing a lot of greenhouse emissions. And this affects the most important attribute or the most important commodity in business, which is trust. So young entrepreneurs should be mindful of these challenges and how to navigate them. The last point here on the challenge is the demand shift. So there's a shift in demand to products which are climate smart. So potentially the product that you are offering, if it's not climate smart, then the demand might be going down. But also a very important factor that comes in related to climate change is that the revenues of people who are getting money from farming reduces. So if it reduces, then you don't have as much demand as you would have if people were really getting revenues as they should. So what are the solutions? One, businesses need to embed climate change mitigation and adaptation measures in their business processes. So when we talk about mitigation here, you are trying to reduce either the emissions or avoid the emissions. So if you were, and beyond the emissions, there are also issues around energy and climate and water. So if you are using a lot of water in your business, if there's a way you can recycle that water and reuse it for another purpose, you are trying to reduce, mitigate. If you are emitting a lot of this greenhouse because of the energy sources that you use, then if you transfer or transit to better renewables, then you are also mitigating. So on the point of adaptation, adaptation is really about coping with climate change. It's there, but you reduce the impact by looking at other alternatives, say irrigation, for example, if the water that you get, the rains are no longer enough. So irrigation here, it's important to emphasize that it should be climate smart irrigation, say drip irrigation. So there's an issue of cost that comes in here, but there are also low cost irrigation solutions that you can look at. So the next point, which I will expound on the next slide, is really embracing the transition to the circular economy and climate smart future. So there are many transitions that are coming up due to climate change, some in water, some on energy, but I'll focus on the food transitions. So these are opportunities that you can take as a young entrepreneur. For example, the alternative protein sources. So we already know that the protein sources, the major protein sources that we have, say beef, goat's meat, they contribute a lot to emissions. And it has been said that producing just 1 kilogram of beef uses over 15,000 liters of water and produces up to 27 kilograms of greenhouse emissions. If you compare that with producing 1 kilogram of beans, it would take you only 10% as much water. And you would produce only 500 grams of greenhouse gases. So supporting the transition from beef, from goat's meat to these plant-based diets is a good way, and entrepreneurs have an opportunity here to innovate products, to innovate ways of trading these commodities, but also enhancing their consumption. The next point is on climate resilient crops. So the dominant crops in our food system globally are rice, wheat, maize, and soybeans. And these crops use a lot of water, but also they're being affected by climate change immensely because they're not resilient. But there are crops which are not as much popular, but are resilient to climate change and will possibly be crops of the future. These include millets, finger millet, pigeon millet, field millet, and sorghum. So entrepreneurs have an opportunity here to innovate products that farmers will like, whether consumers will like, so that the consumption of these crops goes up. But also look at how do you go down to the farmers and entice them to grow these crops. Of course, that's after creating the market. So there's an opportunity there. The last opportunity I'll speak about in this presentation is food loss and wastage reduction. So food production, transportation, and handling contributes immensely to carbon dioxide emissions. But you know, when this food gets to the markets, there's wastage in the market, but also at home on the dining table, some food is not eaten. And when it goes to the landfills, it also produces methane, which is also another big greenhouse gas. So entrepreneurs have an opportunity here to reduce the wastage, but also turn this waste into something that can be used. Also, we need to acknowledge that there are losses that happen on the farm, post-harvest losses. Can these losses be reduced, or can we get some products out of these losses, out of these wastes? So as it has already been mentioned, there are entrepreneurs already in this space doing some good work. There's an entrepreneur we shall hear from on next Thursday who's using insects to try and work on the waste and produce fertilizer, produce feeds, and produce biofuel. So this entrepreneur is ticking 3 boxes. One, you have the feeds, so the animals don't have to compete with humans for protein sources. 2, you are producing biofuel and ticking a box of energy. But also 3, fertilizer. We all know what fertilizer has been a topical discussion, especially in the wake of the Russian invasion on Ukraine. So these are a few opportunities that we can mention here that entrepreneurs on this call in Africa and those elsewhere can take advantage of and be able to respond in a meaningful way to climate change issues, but also support themselves and the livelihoods of others who depend on them. Thank you very much. Back to you, Stephen Ann.
Thank you very much, John. I think one of the key things for this webinar series is it's not just highlighting the problems that we all face. It is actually going to be addressing some of the things that we can do, both as individuals and as entrepreneurs. And I think, John, you've been very clear and very helpful in identifying some of those areas. So thank you very much. Sheila, can I just ask, have we any questions at all coming through? And also, can I encourage people, we have got a second poll. This poll is about resilience to climate change. And we'd just like to ask, in your business, what will you aim to do to be more resilient to climate change? Would you install irrigation? Would you introduce drought-resistant crops? Would you use climate-smart animal feeds? The idea of using insects or the type of trade-based alfalfa fields that Anne was mentioning. Would you consider taking out insurance? Are early warning systems important to you? And as a technology, are green or shade houses important? So how can you move forward? So we'll just give this a few moments. And in the meantime, Sheila, do we have any questions?
Not yet, Steph. I don't have any questions yet.
And that is fine. I'm sure that in future webinars where we have got our friends and colleagues from a whole range of different organizations talking, there'll be plenty of opportunities for questions and so on. So if we can bring the poll to an end, just let's see if we can get to, okay. So we've got 28 people and we can see that the key issue is, oh, we've got a tie, ladies and gentlemen, introduce drought-resistant crops and access early warning systems. Now, I'm really pleased that early warning systems have been identified because our session next week, we have got a company called Ignatia coming in and they run an early warning system across Africa. So it's going to be really interesting what they bring. And so I get the chance just to very quickly conclude. We've really had an excellent hour, I think. I see that Joyce Mafongwe has raised her hand. So let me just bring on Joyce very quickly. Joyce, would you like to say something?
Yes, good morning, Stephen. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the presentation. It's been very interesting. I just want to find out from the presenter, just a question. There was a point where you mentioned the challenges and the opportunities for climate change. And one of the opportunities you mentioned was products which should be climate smart. I didn't really understand. I need clarification on that. Products which are climate smart. What do you mean? Is it products that are produced in a climate smart way? And if that is what you meant, how are the people who are going to buy know that this product was produced in a climate smart way? Thank you.
Really nice questions. I presume that was targeted towards John. So John, what do you mean by climate smart product?
Yeah, that point came when I was talking about, and Steve, I would be happy if you could bring that slide back. Climate resilient crops. So they are crops that are used to produce, for example, beer, and you're talking about barley. Some people are using sorghum and millet. But you realize that a range of products where millet and sorghum are used is limited. And these are crops which are resilient to climate change. They can grow even when there are drought, dry spells, limited water. And I really think that they are crops of the future, especially in the dry land areas of Africa and Asia. So if they are indeed crops of the future, as an entrepreneur, how do you run with that understanding? Can you be able to produce a product? And I see this in Uganda. There are people who have started to produce some products. Here it's commonly known as Bushela. It would be a soft drink. Think of it as you would take soda, but this product is from millet. So they put it on the market and they are promoting it. So this is not to say that this product is only produced in a climate smart way and it has that tag, but it is a product that has been produced from a crop which is resilient. And you know that crop will be there in the future. There are also transitions in terms of what people need to eat or wish to eat. People now know that a maize-based meal would be of less nutritional value compared to a millet-based meal. So this is information we are putting to entrepreneurs to know this so that they can be able to run with this campaign and also benefit from it and benefit their communities. Thank you so much.
Thank you, John.
Maybe just to add how consumers will know. Well, in Europe, we now have a lot of labeling systems, which are, and behind them is some quite complex analysis to really demonstrate that products are better for the environment. So this is starting to be quite widespread in Europe, and I'm sure it will come to Africa in the near future.
Thank you. I hope, Joyce, I've attempted to answer the question. And if you have additions, I am happy to hear your additions and clarifications.
Please, Joyce, please put any more comments into the chat and we will be sharing our emails with you as well. So if I can just very, very quickly conclude, because everybody is busy, no more so than yourselves. We know that there are significant challenges that face Africa because of climate change. And we know that a lot of this is to do with water, whether it's too much or too little, whether it's to do with rising sea levels or to do with declining water supplies or the drying and of rivers and lakes, as well as the intensifying tropical cyclones that we experience in severe weather events. And we know that all of this has got secondary impacts on our agricultural systems, on our food production, as well as on a range of other environmental and social factors. And when it comes to the ecosystem that we live in, the planet that we live on, the one planet that we know in the universe can sustain human life, we know that we are part of an ecosystem that includes individual people, that includes businesses ranging from a small one-person informal business on a street in Kampala, all the way to the massive global multinational companies that are involved in food production and in digital technologies and everything else. And we know that governments have a role to play as well in terms of providing regulations, guidance, infrastructure to provide that framework that we all live within and operate within. So we all need to consider how and what we do and what we can do as individuals and as entrepreneurs to help move forward in a changing world. Sorry, there was just one slide. Brilliant, thank you. And the key things here that I really hope will come through this entire series. One is, how do we build resilience? How do we actually become better, both as individuals and as entrepreneurs, in being able to withstand and cope with the effects of climate change? We also need to look at adaptation. What can we do differently within our lives and our businesses to enable us to do better and to continue growing in a sustainable way? And that can be about strategies, it can be about technologies, it can be about knowledge. And then there is mitigation. Other ways that we can incorporate at a local level things, strategies, tools, technologies, approaches into our work that can actually help with reducing the levels of carbon in our atmosphere. And these are the three big challenges, but not just for us. I'm really grateful that Amos in the chat room has given us all the challenge of how do we pass this information on to smallholder farmers and emerging farmers who do not have access to data or smartphones, so they do not have access to this type of information. And I think it's important for all of us as entrepreneurs that as we develop our own value chains, that we're promoting people to move forward with us, that we're encouraging people, smallholder farmers and emerging farmers and the communities to which they belong, so that they themselves become more resilient and adaptive to the changing climate. And we have a role in that as people involved in business and developing our own value chains. And on that note, can I say thank you to everybody who I know that there are more questions, and I know that some of those questions will be answered over the next several weeks. The next session that we have is Thursday, same place, same time. So when I say place, I mean the same link that you used today. And next week, we'll be looking at food systems and value chains. And it's going to be a really interesting look at the world of which we are a part. And over the next several weeks, we will be having a really amazing group of people speaking live, engaging directly with us, sharing their knowledge, sharing their skills, sharing their experience, so that we can all move forwards in a sustainable way. Thank you for your time, and I think the recording should finish now.